Okay, so I am very happy to introduce our speaker today. And whoops, there we go. So welcome to Brad Wind. He is the general manager of Northern Water. Northern Water is a conservancy district situated in northeastern Colorado that encompasses 615,000 irrigable acres and is home to more than 1 million Coloradans. Northern Water's board of directors, together with its 185-member staff, partner with the United States Bureau of Reclamation to operate the Colorado Big Thompson project. We will hear a lot about today. In addition, Northern Water operates the Windy Gap project and oversees 4 other water activity enterprises. During Brad's 29-year tenure at Northern Water, he has provided leadership roles throughout the organization and has engaged on water right issues on both the South Platte River and the Colorado River. Additionally, he has assisted in revising water-related policies to reflect the changing demand and use for water within the region. Brad is the 6th general manager of Northern Water and took on this role in 2018. As a native of Colorado, Mr. Wind was raised on an irrigated farm along the South Platte River in Washington County. Brad began his college education at Fort Lewis College in Durango, eventually attending Colorado State University to complete a Bachelor of Science degree in agricultural engineering and civil engineering. Brad went on to attend graduate school at the University of California, Davis, and completed a Master of Science degree in agricultural engineering in 1993. More recently, he completed a Master of Business Administration degree from Colorado State University. Brad remains active in production agriculture through his interest in his farm near Snyder, Colorado. Brad is a registered professional engineer in the states of California and Colorado. So let's give a welcome to Brad.
Well, good afternoon. It's hard to get energized this time of day for all of us. Who knows where Snyder is? Snyder, Colorado? Doesn't really matter. How about who's heard of Northern Water? Just out of curiosity, okay. That's a higher percentage than I'm accustomed to. Northern Water is an agency that's kind of been behind the scenes. We're created in 1937 and created to partner with Reclamation to build the CBT project. I'll talk more about that. So let's just jump into this. Let me ask a follow-up question. Do you all, as kind of your angle at water, is it science related, policy, engineering, all the above? Kind of all the above. Very good. All right. Well, when I talk about water, and Karen, we have 50 minutes, 40-ish minutes. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. I remind folks, at least in my perspective, albeit perhaps this might sound odd, but I view water like religion. We all kind of have our different views about religion, certainly myself included. It kind of shifts from year to year as my parents are disappointed that I don't go to church enough. Maybe not at all. But I think water is in some ways is similar. We all have our own perspective, and some of that perspective is clearly the biases, good and bad, that we gain over our careers and through our childhood. And for me, that means being a native. I have a perspective on water in Colorado, being from Eastern Colorado and being raised on an irrigated farm. That gave me a certain kind of perspective. I tend to think food and fiber is important, and irrigation allows for that to happen on a grander scale. My time at CSU gave me bias, some of it provided by Dr. Robert Ward right here in our class. Again, good or bad, but it's bias. And when you hear people talk about water, always take that into consideration, that's where some of our words come from, is that long history. And for me, it continued on when I went to grad school. And when you work for an agency for almost 30 years, believe me, you get some would call it a perspective, but it's really a bias as to how I think the world is or could be or should be. So a whole lot of caveats and filters to what I might talk about. So where am I pointing this guy to? Maybe I could get rid of that. please, I'd encourage you as we visit this afternoon, got a question, comments, want to raise the white flag and say, Brad, I just don't agree. I can't get on board with that. I'm good. I want to talk a little bit about Northern Water, the CBT project, which is an amazing project, but I'm going to assume probably most of you are not here to talk about dams and hydropower plants and pump plants, but it's really an important perspective of how the CBT, Colorado Big Thompson project operates, but more so focus on kind of this quandary, right? What's the quandary? Modern day quandary with water in the West? Supply and demand. There's not an equal sign there anymore, right? That's kind of, in my view, the underlying quandary, not just from demand from a perspective of irrigation and us in our homes and industry, but we've had in the last 30 to 40 years kind of recognition that there's another demand, and that's the environment. And all that stuff doesn't always equate. And our challenge around projects like the CBT are, can we optimize it for all these new things in which to consider? So I'm going to bounce around a bit. You had some homework. I'm going to pull a few sections out of that. If folks got through that, it's some pretty easy reading. I think there's some good history in there. There's plenty more from where that came from and the era in which that came from. But in terms of Northern Water, kind of the very basics. The green area on the map is our service area. And again, we're created in 1937 after 15 to 20 years of grappling with the reality that we in the East Slope in northeastern Colorado, in the South Platte, essentially from Denver north to Greeley and east to Julesburg to the state line of Nebraska, we're a little bit short on water. And there was recognition, albeit initial analyzation suggested it would be really hard to bring water from other parts of Colorado into the South Platte. After more analysis and work by reclamation, it was deemed possible and Northern Water was created. So our service boundary really is from the city and county of Broomfield. More specifically, if you're on 120th and you look north, that's part of Northern Water service area. If you're on 120th south, you're not part of our district. And there's a long story on why it's 120th, but that's our southern part of our Front Range service area up to north near Wellington. So north of Fort Collins, about 15 or 20 miles, where there's irrigated acres up there. And then really it just tapers down to follow the South Platte through eastern Weld County, Morgan County, Logan County, and Sedgwick County. So the CBT, you've got to talk about machinery and what it does. Kind of the basis, again, of our existence. And this was not unique to Northern Water. This was when reclamation, the turn of the 19th century, 20th century, pursued projects in the West, the 17 Western states. And they always looked for an agency, either existing or that could be, to, in essence, co-op with them to advocate for a project, to create additional water supplies. In the case of CBT and Northern Water, it's very much focused on a supplemental supply, and we'll get into more details about that, versus many of the projects throughout the West that has a reclamation signature on it were to bring new ground, farm ground into production. Washington, places in Wyoming, Idaho, California, Arizona, that was the full intent. With the CBT project, it was a supplemental supply, kind of recognition that we were water short at the time we were created. So the CBT project looks west in Grand County, and essentially the large reservoir in the project, which is Lake Granby, collects water as it follows snow melt, primarily in Rocky Mountain National Park and a little bit to the west. Collects water at that point, and through after runoff, that water is repositioned to a tunnel that takes that water under the Continental Divide, through the Continental Divide, and pops out to just above Estes Park. And from there, it travels through hydropower plants that are owned by the federal government, Bureau of Reclamation, and that power is sold regionally without Northern Water's involvement to many power agencies that we're familiar with. I have another circle on here called Green Mountain Reservoir. And if you read like the second bullet on the Senate Document 80, it talks about Green Mountain Reservoir. And often folks who know a little bit about the CBT never make the connection that Green Mountain Reservoir is part of the project. And that was compensatory storage that was required by Colorado statute when a conservancy district like Northern builds a supplemental supply or a supply of any kind. There's a statutory requirement to compensate, if you will, the basin of origin. So where the water came from. And of course, this came from the Colorado River. So Green Mountain really is that compensatory storage that both replaces water when the CBT is diverting out of priority, and we will go too far down that road, but also provides additional supply to farmers in the Grand Valley near Grand Junction, as well as through augmentation plans. Interestingly enough, it actually provides offsetting water for snowmaking for the ski industry in part. So a lot of statistics about the CBT project. It's from an engineering standpoint, I think we can all say it's a pretty impressive piece of machinery collectively. As mentioned, 1.6 million acres total in our service area, of which about 615,000 acres are irrigated. Not, again, CBT is supplemental, so those acres have another supply. We call it a native supply at Northern Water or a base supply. So it's a supply from Cooter River, Big Thompson, St. Vrain, Boulder Creek, or the South Platte. That's their primary supply. And then in many cases to those farmers, ranchers that might own the water in which Northern Water provides, CBT water, it would be supplemental to that supply. Projects constructed from 38 to 57. A lot of challenges during that time. You got World War II, you've got Depression, rising costs of construction costs, and ultimately Horsetooth was finally completed the end of the project in 1958 and started full operation in 1958. And on average, the project, for reasons I'll describe, the yield or the delivery from the project can be way up, way down, but over the long haul is about 215,000 acre feet per year. That's about a quarter of the supply in the South Platte. So I'll try to keep making a connection back to the South Platte. So it's more than a blip on the screen in terms of how we've continued to meet the demand, the growing demand on the South Platte with CBT and other projects that have come online, kind of following when most of the water was spoken for in the South Platte, right? 1860, you got water rights being spoken for. You've got a lot of filing for water rights, senior water rights that might include filings up to 1890, 1900. And really, by many accounts, water was pretty much spoken for at that point. And then, of course, we transitioned into developing storage, junior water rights that could be filled, reservoir vessels that could be filled in the wintertime when there wasn't the irrigation demand. And then that water from those reservoirs could be used for irrigation, supplemental supply to irrigation, or for municipalities and industry. Lots of pieces of the project, 12 reservoirs, really 4 bays and after bays, trying to get the water positioned to northeastern Colorado, 95 miles of canal. I mentioned the hydroelectric plants and a lot of transmission. Actually, interestingly enough, I find this fascinating. Actually, the electrical piece, once the energy is generated, gets handed over to the Department of Energy, which is WAPA, Western Area Power Administration, then administers the marketing of that power and moving that across the grid that they own. So, takeaways from Senate Document 80. I just pulled out a few things that I find fascinating. I think folks who came before us did such a fabulous job describing history in their documents and kind of why something's important. And this document, Northern Water has really 3 founding documents that we look to for our primary guidance. Senate Document 80, which was just that, really advocated for the project and from a higher elevation, what the project was going to do, who was going to do it for, what it consisted of. Not everything in Senate Document 80 that's described in Senate Document 80 actually got built. If you were reading carefully, for example, there was an Arkansas Reservoir that's described in Senate Document 80 that was going to be between Masonville and Loveland. Didn't happen for different reasons. Again, war, depression, other things came into play where the project didn't get fully built as it was originally envisioned. But this first section, this is in the first couple of paragraphs of Senate Document 80, kind of recognizing that there was surplus water in the West Slope and talking about water that otherwise would have gone to the Pacific is now coming to Horsetooth Reservoir, to a tap near you, right? If you're here on campus or wherever you live in Fort Collins or Larimer County, you're consuming in part water that otherwise would have gone to the Pacific. That's kind of hard to think of, but in fact, that's what's happened. I highlight the word surplus, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, but I have some thoughts, and they're pretty strong thoughts about a future existing and future concern about as we continue to have growing demand in Colorado, pretty nice place to live, right? We're gonna have more people here, likely more industry, that takes more water, and where's it gonna come from? If you look throughout the state, there's a bullseye one place, northeastern Colorado. And when I express my concern about what implications that has to our homeland here in northeastern and northern Colorado, people counter that and say, well, gosh, Brad, that's a little hypocritical. I've been called worse. That's not the worst world. How do you express concerns about that, but yet recognizing the CBT acquired water across the Continental Divide? My response to that is kind of one distinction in the fact, and this word speaks to that. That water was filed for, it was a junior water right, it was unappropriated supplies. So it's water that had not yet been developed. When I talk a few slides from now about this fear of extraction of water that's currently used in northern Colorado and taking to other areas, primarily the metro area, I think that's a different conversation with a different impact. I mentioned here, it calls it out kind of right at the beginning, the importance of Green Mountain, which is extremely important to the West Slope, but yet part of the CBT project, and Northern Water and the federal government pay for the ongoing operation and maintenance of that facility. That's in part to the benefit of the West Slope. A couple other things I pulled out of there, and you've sure in your other readings recognize that we folks who came well before me, 100-year plus before me, really crafted how we think about water in the West. What you learn here at CSU and through this class and other classes related to water law and water policy, we were kind of cutting edge. We had some folks who came before us that just were very visionary in how they thought about water, integrating groundwater and surface water, something other states didn't follow too quickly, maybe wish they had. But it was interesting in this Senate Document 80, they kind of call out the fact that, again, this is 1937, they call out that fact that Colorado has been a leader. In the middle paragraph, just highlighting that we were, some years still are, water short. The junior water right holders, right? What would junior, 1937, well, who's junior? An 1890 water right? 1890 and 1900 water right. Yeah, it's good when you got snowmelt going on, but you've all, I'm sure, been exposed to the priority system in which at some point, in the middle of summer, a 1900 water right doesn't get you very far because you've got to yield to those who developed water before you. So it really calls out the fact that, yep, we're short, and a lot of juniors cannot, in essence, grow a crop that spans the entire growing season in northeastern Colorado. Questions? Again, the last paragraph, he hinted to this. Many, if not most every other reclamation project was breaking new ground for production under irrigation scenarios. In the last paragraph, and we see this through our founding documents time and time again, of CBT being supplemental. I don't think I finished the 3 documents. Did I mention that? I didn't. Thank you. Conservancy Act, that allows Northern Water to be. There's other, and really, it was Northern Water and those who had a vision of how to create this agency that could marry up with reclamation to make it all happen, stimulated that statute and called it a law to create Northern Water, and again, other conservancy districts. So that's kind of one of our founding documents. You got set in document 80, which you got a piece of, and our repayment contract. And that's an agreement between Northern Water and reclamation that goes into pretty detailed description of a more formal arrangement on who's going to do what, when, and why between Northern Water and reclamation, because we operate the project jointly. We pay for the project jointly. So it's really those 3 documents that really tell Northern Water kind of where the boundaries of the road are, so to speak. Getting back to this, kind of tying this to the South Platte. Remember, my mind's mostly wrapped around a supply coming from the Colorado River and then providing to at least the lower reaches of the South Platte. In Northern Waters, kind of mind, think about our southern border where it hits the South Platte, near Brighton, near Fort Lupton. That's kind of when it's Northern Water country. And so we think about supplies that are coming in from the Poudre and the Big Thompson, the St. Vrain and Boulder Creek, and then the main stem of the South Platte. But in that document that you read portions of, I found this table really interesting, and we have a habit in our current day of really analyzing the heck out of things, right? Got to run it through a model and then model it again and then model the model, where this table is kind of pretty basic. It's like, well, in 1926, we had a pretty good year. We had a pretty good water year. That was considered a full water supply. And let's just analyze a number of years between 1925 and 1935. And what was that water supply from the basins, the ones I mentioned, and how does it compare to this fabulous year of 1926? Whatever that delta is, that's what we should recognize as a supplemental need to the region to bring it up year in and year out to a full supply. Simple stuff, and it's pretty convincing. And at the end of the day, there was a recognition that we were 310,000 acre feet short of a water supply, and wouldn't it be great if we had a project that could do that? And thus, let it be the CBT, the Colorado Big Thompson project. Again, yes.
Has demand changed since then? Like I know that like this like that's like I can find how much there was in a great water year in that 11-year average. But like, does that cover, I guess, the demand back then versus the demand now? Like I'm like we're not going to make more water, but we're trying to reuse it. So is that
a good question. I think at a high level, it's, you know, we've got, when Northern Water was created in 1937 by the vote of the people, by the way, it's either 115 or 150,000 people lived within the district boundary. Now it's 1.1 million. So people equates to demand. I think we've all found ways to make water go farther, so it's not really a one-to-one correlation. But I would say absolutely that demand continues to grow, and we've got to kind of bend the curve on that. Not surprising, many of those homes and places we live are occurring on irrigated lands. So when that often, not always, but often when those lands transition from a cornfield to homes, that water is kind of transitioned from an irrigation use to municipal use one way or another. So that kind of backfills some of that growing demand. But a lot of our homes are being built on dryland acres. So that requires another supply to feed that demand. So, and then folks who are much more engaged on the challenges around our climate and increased variability, kind of spend time worrying about what that might mean for our future in terms of increased evapotranspiration rates and demand on water. And from what I can gather, you know, climate change within our district, there's kind of varied models. They all suggest more variability. Some of them actually suggest constant, if not growing supply, but yet more variable, which brings challenges onto itself. But clearly some models that suggest that supply is not going to be there either. So I wanted to relate it kind of that one piece. There is a column in this table that talks about return flows. And I bring that up only because we're focusing on the South Platte, which is really, Karen, I don't know if another presenter yet has, you've got just a great cast of characters that are going to be talking about the South Platte. The South Platte is really the main stem from north of Denver to Julesburg is really driven by return flows. As it gets dried up from time to time by the senior water users of the day. Could be a reservoir in the wintertime. It could be an irrigation system in Morgan County in the summertime. When it gets dried up within a few miles, it becomes, it's not the Mississippi, but it becomes a river again. And that's really driven by these return flows, this great fortune that we have where the aquifer near the South Platte is not, it's not confined, it's not closed, it's draining into the South Platte. Areas where I was raised and where I'm involved in farming now, the waste that occurs from irrigation, and that's just a foregone conclusion, much of it goes through the soil profile into the aquifer, and it's headed back to the river. And it rebuilds that river from time to time. And I bring that up because in our repayment contract, there's specific language that recognize that the CBT project, that bringing over what folks thought was going to be 310,000 acre feet didn't really happen that way. It ended up being about 217,000 acre feet a year. But there was recognition that the value of that water coming northeastern Colorado was not only to those who got the first right to use it, but also those who enjoyed the waste from that first use, which we call return flows. And it's embedded in our contract. It's really some wonky language that describes that Northern Water, in essence, shall protect those return flows that come from your homes, by the way. They come from a farmer's field, and we should protect those for our constituents that are downstream. We're doing a lot of that these days. We are in daily contact with data. This sounds like a weird world, but we understand wastewater treatment plants and their contributions back to various streams along the Front Range, Poudre, Big Thompson, St. Vrain, South Platte. And we calculate with data coming from wastewater treatment operators, what percentage of that flow is return flows from CBT. And make sure that we can do our best to protect that for those that are downstream. Why did that become a thing? There's interesting history there. Farmers, primarily at the time, who were advocating for a CBT project, at least along the Front Range, were a little bit in contrast to farmers further east, who were all about more supply, but recognized you're not going to deliver horsetooth water to a farm in Logan County. You can't do it. In the middle of summer, it's a long ways out there. It can't be done. And ultimately, what was agreed upon is that if the return flows could be protected for their use downstream, people would support the project. So imagine that, politics meets engineering. Hard to believe, right? So that's a big deal for us these days. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. One?
How do you calculate the percentage of CBD water that's coming out of reclamation?
So for we're not doing that as of yet on the irrigation side. A lot of variables, as many of you would know, in terms of kind of how that water is getting used throughout different ditch systems in the Front Range. But on the municipal side, many municipalities, because of their water rights portfolio and analysis they've done on other supplies, they often are pretty aware and documented, often in change cases, what percentage of a water supply that goes into their system gets consumed by us. And we all know, right, in our homes, there's not much consumption. 1%, 2%, it's our yards. And I'll get on that bandwagon in a little bit. But they have their numbers that they use. We tend to adopt some of those numbers, which helps us calculate that number and the outflow, that's CBT return flows. So a little bit more about CBT. Again, this is trying to connect the South Platte, where we're trying to meet that supplemental demand with a Colorado supply, something very unique to Northern Water. I've not ever seen this in the West, a bit counterintuitive, but as our board, probably their board of 13, representing counties along the Front Range, in which have 3 board members, except for the city and county of Broomfield has 1. And then in Eastern Colorado, each county has 1, and there's 1 board member who covers both Washington and Morgan. But one of the most important things they do, by the way, they're appointed by judges, which I just think is fascinating, as I tell people that from other parts of the US, how unique that is and how, albeit some are critical of that, it really creates consistency upon how our board members come to Northern Water. They tend to stay for many years, reapply for their positions. And when you're appointed by judges, there's not a lot of folks showing up and going away and showing up. They tend to come, and they're very well, much expertise on water, and it takes a number of years to kind of get up to speed on at least what our mission is and objective, as a side note. But one of the most important things they do every year is set the quota, what we call the quota, which is really the allocation of CBT water. And you can see it's kind of all over the board, from a low of 50%. What does 50% means? It means if you are the owner of one of these shares of CBT, we call them units, there's 310,000 of them. Think about a corporation with 310,000 shares. If you own one of them, we call it an acre-foot unit. We're not very creative at Northern Water, too many engineers. An acre-foot unit, if the board issues a 50% quota, that 1 acre-foot unit equates to 0.5 acre-feet. When would they do that? This is a trick question. They do it on a year where the native supplies, the supplies here in the South Platte, are ample. They're good. We're in a good water year, because we're in a good water year. It shouldn't take much CBT to supplement the area to make us whole, if you will. On the flip side, when you're having a challenging hydrology and it's dry, soil moisture is depleted, reservoirs are not full, what does the board do? They say, we need to turn up the knob. We need to issue more water out of the project. More or less, the project has about 3 years worth of supply. So you've got that ability to turn it up when you need to. Don't want to abuse it. I'm going to be looking for a job if the reservoirs end up empty. I get that, but it's a really unique methodology that we enjoy here in Northern Colorado that gives our board a lot of flexibility, dare I say, on how the project's operated with reclamation. So what's happened over the years? The project really was predicated on supplementary irrigation demand, and over time, these 2 lines suggest what's happened to these ownership of these units, which can be transferred between different uses. And primarily, not surprising in today's era, there's transfers from agriculture, better for worse. It's up to what we call the allottee that holds an allotment contract with Northern Water, that's the owner of that unit. And if he or she desires, they make a few phone calls, they might talk to a water broker, and they make arrangements in which that water can be, with approval of the Northern Water Board, can be transferred to other uses. And often that's industry or municipalities, or what we call special districts, which are water utilities that provide a lot of water to rural areas. Some of those areas used to be more rural than they are now, but they're big users of CBT. So over the years, that transition has happened. And now you can see we've gone from 90+% ownership by ag interests to 75% ownership by municipal and industrial agencies.
So when you say transfer, do you mean like sold, like they sell their water rights to municipalities?
They do, and more specifically in this case, they're selling a contractual right, but that's kind of decimal dust talk. But yep.
So like the ag user, the ones that have.
So the ag user kind of recognizes what he or she's doing. Now there is with the flexibility with how the project's operated and how many of Northern Water's policy, there is the ability to lease CBT on an annual basis, but you're not the owner of it. You're striking an arrangement by somebody who is the owner. They, for different reasons, say, I think I'm good this year, or I don't need all my CBT, and I'll lease you a certain amount for some certain price. Yep. Now, what happens on the farm? Some cases that farmer might be selling because their farm's getting developed. In other instances, they're farming and they're making that calculation. We do this every day, right? It's like, well, should I spend $1 here or $1 there? They're making a determination whether perhaps that cash is more important to them now than the water. And in cases in which that water departs the farm, remember, it's a supplemental supply. So in a lot of cases, that farming operation, that farming unit goes back to a pre-1958 mode. 1958, right? Because that's when the project came online. So those farmers, I won't say they were doing well. They all recognized they were short on water before 1958. But now, probably in a lot of cases, they need to think about, okay, I need to change my cropping patterns, or I'm going to lease water for a while, knowing that probably isn't going to be a perpetual arrangement. But they're shifting gears at the farm gate to deal with lesser of a water supply. Yes.
How much trees develop their land or they get paid for their land? You mentioned about the land.
I'm sorry, I'm using kind of inside baseball lingo. So when a farmer, let's say if one owned a farm near Fort Collins and Fort Collins was growing, there's probably better examples in some of the communities around Fort Collins that are growing horizontally versus vertically. Fort Collins is doing that since I left town. So that's the farmers I'm thinking of, in which if a community annexes, they say, okay, Mr. Farmer, we would like to bring that land into our community. That farmer might be enticed to sell his native supply, so his non-CBT supply, but then also enticed to sell his or her CBT supply. And then the land is developed not into a different kind of farming, but into homes. Does that make sense, Karen?
I was wondering if there was ever, you said the board approves the transactions. They have to have a just reason to disapprove the transaction?
They need a just reason to approve or disapprove. You have to be your envisioned use of that CBT supply. You have to have a defined beneficial and recognized by Northern Water beneficial use. The question then would come up, has Northern Water ever disallowed a transfer? And in my career, one time specifically, in our board has a very strong opinion. I share that opinion. And if there's speculation involved, right? Somebody acquiring, this happens all the time in water, but our board has a strong opinion. It should not, to the degree it can be prevented, allow or promote philosophies in which CBT is acquired to speculate on it. The board really wants that water to go to a beneficial use. It's a federal project. It was in part subsidized by the federal government. It's paid for by citizens of northeastern Colorado, and their opinion is that's not an appropriate use of the water.
What's been the role of eminent domain?
Could you be, well, let me first respond. In our world, eminent domain is really constrained or limited to how Northern Water, in very rare instances, might pursue the construction of facilities, specifically pipelines, where we, if needed, would express eminent domain over property and the use of that property for, in that case, a pipeline. but not so much in terms of kind of water use or water rights.
I'm thinking more, I think Thornton one time used eminent domain to go after some water rights. I don't know that it was in the Northern District, but I could be wrong there.
The acquisition of the mass acquisition of water supplies by Thornton, and you're going to hear from Emily Hunt here in a couple of weeks, great friend of mine. Will describe their acquisition of 18,000 acres of land around Alt, some closer to Fort Collins, but the primary, the bullseye was around Alt, in which they acquired 18,000 acres, and she'll describe the challenges they're having in getting that water ultimately to Thornton. Through those acquisitions, I'm almost certain none of that was through eminent domain. They might have situations closer to their service area where they've maybe been up against that, but I think among the water user community, that's just not a lever you want to pull. That just does not make friends.
Sure. Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. So kind of back to the question of this transfer of water over time, you can imagine, remember that supply and demand is kind of a little bit wonky. Pretty basic economics might suggest that over time, when you don't have a lot of other water supplies to go to, CBT becomes more valuable. And this graphic just shows that acre foot unit, remember 310,000 of them, they were initially acquired for $1.50. You had to get people to sign up to commit to pay for annual operation maintenance costs. And now they're in the range of, I just heard last week, $55,000 to $65,000 per acre foot unit. So water's getting spendy. Yes. No, that's a great question. Certainly in 2002, I mean, folks were understandably so. We're getting a little concerned about the project and the reliability of CBT through a 50-year drought or a 100-year drought. So the price, certainly the leasing price, the rental price went up exorbitantly during those years. But I would say it's more a reflection of the economy in northern Colorado. If communities are growing and they're selling taps for new homes, they're in the market. Either they as a city or the underlying developer or developers. If they're making money selling homes, they're going to ramp up their acquisition of CBT. But really, remember, there's an end game, right? It's fixed, 310,000 units. At some point, this isn't the candy machine anymore. We got to think of other things to provide this supply, as well as other, dare I say, changes in how we live in the West. This game can't continue on forever. It's a fixed number of units, and it's quickly transitioning to urban supply. I'm going to just say a few things about another project Northern Water's involved in since the mid-1980s. It was envisioned in the late 1960s. It really kind of came out of concern by the water user community at the time that saw this transitioning of CBT away from agriculture into the municipal and industrial sector. And to their credit, they said, boy, we don't want to let that happen to the end. We should pursue another project, another water supply from the Colorado River, and that was called Windy Gap. And I point out on this graphic, there's a Windy Gap pump plant and Windy Gap Reservoir that spans until last week. This is interesting history. Until last week, that Windy Gap Reservoir dam spanned the entire Colorado River in Grand County, near between Hot Sulphur Springs and the town of Granby. And as of last week, part of that dam's been removed for a reason we'll talk about in a second. But in 1985, that project was built, in essence, to bring water not just from the Colorado River, but also from the Fraser. So water coming out of Winter Park, Tabernash, Winnan Priority, it's a junior water right as well, would pump water into the CBT project. And you can do that through some federal law and policy where you, in essence, lease water from the federal government, from the Bureau of Reclamation, lease facilities and the use of those facilities And so the Windy Gap project leases facilities and the ability to transport Windy Gap water through the CBT, temporarily store it in Granby, through the tunnel. It gets to Horsetooth and Carter, and we deliver that Windy Gap water to 15, 17 different owners of Windy Gap. So it's another, again, supplemental supply. That's the Windy Gap pump plant. Quickly, anybody heard of Chimney Hollow Reservoir here? Oh my gosh. Northern Water is in year 2.2-ish of building Chimney Hollow Reservoir. It's 5 miles west of Berthoud. It's right behind Carter Lake. Everybody know where Carter Lake is? You need to come to Northern Water. We're gonna give you a tour, Karen. Windy Gap, I mentioned Windy Gap leases this storage from the federal government. That doesn't always work well for lots of different reasons. They've always wanted their own storage. So as we speak, behind Carter Lake and the valley behind Chimney Hollow, again, engineers are not very creative, so it's Chimney Hollow Reservoir. That dam will be the highest dam built in the United States in the last 30 years. And we're at about 148 feet from its starting point. We've got another 1.9 years of construction, 2 years of construction. And it's quite a feat. There's between night shift and day shift, there's 500 folks who are working on this roughly $600 million project.
It's not water, and there's a lot of climate policy and carbon markets going on. Do you foresee Northern Water being responsible for the methane in terms of reservoirs, or is that factored into some of the operations?
It is not. It is not, but I would imagine that will be in conversations down the road. Yep. Good question. It's challenging when you're providing a public benefit. You know, how do you split the pie? Who is responsible? Who gets the benefits? Lots of challenging. I just quickly mentioned this, that I mentioned this Windy Gap Reservoir. We're extremely proud of building Chimney Hollow Reservoir. It's kind of a big thing here in Colorado to get another reservoir online. Not always to meet more demand. There's kind of two aspects, right? You could have growing demand, but we're all have a mindset that we need to, at the same time, increase our resiliency to whatever challenges lie in the future. How can you do that? I'm not here saying reservoirs are the only way to do that, but they're a pretty key component to being able to assure that we can all go to our homes, and to perhaps a slightly lesser degree, agriculture can have a supply that's there year in, year out through variable climates and other challenges we might have, including there could be a day when the CBT project has a bad day and pipeline goes down, or the tunnel might have implications, or a power plant, those kinds of things. But in order to get Chimney Hollow off the ground, they're through building projects like a reservoir these days, there's a lot of mitigation that's negotiated and required to offset the impacts in which you're placing on the environment to do those kinds of things. So I mentioned Windy Gap Reservoir shrinking. Why is it shrinking? By about a third. So we can reconnect the Colorado River to places above Windy Gap Reservoir, which is not a big reservoir. It's only just kind of a wide spot in the river, but it has impacts on fish and ecology. And so next to this smaller Windy Gap Reservoir is a recreated Colorado River, about 1.5 miles long, and the west slope, rightfully so. This is really important to them, and touring that site, I totally get it. It's something we all should be doing. So I'm going to try in 8-9 minutes, just kind of some things that to ponder. I'm sure even though we're focused on the South Platte, which has a lot of its own challenges in different ways, the Colorado River had some challenging hydrology, 20 years of a pretty notable dry cycle, and the average yield from the Colorado River is not what we hope it could be, should be. And you're all reading articles about how do you deal with it under the compacts and agreements that are in place. coupled with guidelines that will define the operation of Powell and Meade moving forward. I won't even venture into that area. That's certainly not my expertise. At Northern Water, I think like a lot of agencies, you kind of realize we've got to gauge around these subjects. They're sticky. They're really sticky. And probably 60, 80, 100 years ago, agencies, I'm not suggesting this was Northern Water, of course, but you could kind of get things done without the need for a lot of dialogue with public that might share your opinions and others who might not. That's heavy on our mind on how to do that better. And it's hard work. It's hard work in part because no one knows who Northern Water is. None of you, Karen, gets the A for the day, sorry. But Northern Water, I mean, I'm not saying we're the end all, but we're a regional water supply, operate with reclamation, Horsetooth and Carter. I mean, we kind of get things done. We've got miles of pipeline that go clear out to Morgan County. Fort Collins, half of their water supply comes from Northern Water. It takes time to tell our story and share some of our philosophies, which I think are important to how we move forward in Northern Colorado. I mentioned increasing resiliency, a lot of different ways to do that. We spend time at Northern Water, obviously advancing projects like, let me ask you the next question. Who has heard of NISP, the Northern Integrated Supply Project? Some are not fans of that project. That's a Northern Water project. For lots of different reasons, folks might not appreciate it's important to Northern Colorado, but many of our participants, as we call them, that are paying for that avocation of that reservoir, it's important to them. So it's not just about the reservoir building, but the graphic on the right is kind of how owners of Windy Gap and CBT and someday NISP, other supplies of water, trying to create policy and programs that allow them a lot of flexibility in how they use water, when they use water, what's the appropriate use of water, that also can add resiliency. We can't not think about this. The consumptive use that we have that grows in the Front Range and other parts of Colorado, but we're water short in the metro area, Colorado Springs, Pueblo, I mean, just up and down the Front Range corridor. We should probably question what we're doing in our yards. Just simply saying, I'm a culprit. I got a lot of that stuff on the left in my yard. Can we do with less of it? Because remember, that's the consumptive use piece. When you're taking a shower in the morning, 1/4% of the water you use is consumptively used. It goes down the drain, it's treated, it's headed out to another use in Colorado, maybe helping the environment. When we're growing things like grass, now again, I'm a farmer's son, so don't think I'm against consumptive use of crops. But in the urban areas of the Front Range, we should be thinking about, can we make this transition, how to do it, how to pay for it. It's not cheap. It is not cheap. Removing grass is the easy piece. How you make the landscape on the right takes time and money. I hinted to this. This is a growing concern, and we're being more vocal about as we analyze our water future in Northern Colorado. And it might not feel good to some, where I'm kind of bifurcating Colorado into what I think might be winners and losers. But we are so blessed to have really a pretty ample water supply within our Northern Water service area. So what happens, not if, but as others come to our backyard? Emily will talk from Thornton about why they made that decision in 1985 to do it. Relates to Two Forks Reservoir. And there's these dots all connect. Two Forks doesn't get built. Well, in that case, Thornton had a sense that Two Forks wasn't going to get permitted, and they went down a different road and thought coming to Northern Colorado would provide them their next supply. And in fact, someday it will. What's the end game? Are we going to, how do we slow that? We probably can't as a community stop it. We should talk about it because Northern Colorado is different for you and for your kids and your kids' kids if the water that's enjoyed in Northern Colorado, primarily by irrigated agriculture, if others acquire it and move it elsewhere. Now, you can say, well, that's a perpetual preservation of irrigated agriculture. I think food and fiber are important. I think they'll be important to the future generations. But my view is Northern Colorado, that fundamental building block of the economy, water, is extracted from Northern Colorado and placed for use in the metro area or for a growing Aurora. Hope you're not from Aurora, but it's a good example. Those who come after us will have less tools to make Northern Colorado what it is or what we want it to become. Water is just so fundamental, whether it's for irrigating corn or broccoli or using it for the environment. When that water's gone, it's not coming back. And just a slide. It's been a chance. These fires, maybe before some of you came to Colorado State University, the summer of 2020, East Troublesome Fire was in the watershed of Windy Gap and the CBT. And when you have that kind of fires, similar fire on Cameron Peak, they're challenging to recover from. It creates in some parts of the watershed lands that are so susceptible to erosion. And it's going to take years for that to recover. And a lot of great folks are thinking about how do you accelerate that? What could we all do as a society to, I wouldn't say prevent it, but prepare for watersheds and forests that are different, are older, have beetle kill, a lot of things I'm clearly not an expert on, but it's something we're so blessed to have lands in our headwaters that are protected from most things, right? We're not doing bad things up there, but this fire stuff is really challenging. Karen, 1 minute to spare. I just put a lot out there.
Any other questions for Brad?
Please.
What's the update on the tables of water you setting back then?
Happy to. So NISP, again, never let an engineer name a project, Northern Integrated Supply Project. Most folks, the analogy for that is Glade Reservoir, which is a proposed reservoir. We call it Ted's Place, but essentially where 287 and Highway 14 bifurcate northwest of town here, about 5 miles. That's the kind of the core storage vessel. There's other aspects of the project that make it quite unique, frankly. Certainly, over the years, we're 18 years of permitting. We now have all the permits in place, save a permit that now likely will be required, depending on how the alignments of some pipeline come in and out and through the city of Fort Collins. They've got some new regulations that we're kind of digesting and understanding on how that has implications to the final design of the project. But we're full design right now. We've got another 1.5 years of design. And then that project, absent litigation, which happens. It happened with the Chimney Hollow Reservoir. We were wrapped up in litigation with the environmental and conservation community for a few years. So that certainly can happen and slow things to some degree, or as courts analyze really what's at question is the adequacy of the 404 permit from the Corps of Engineers in this case. Well, thank you, Karen. Thank you all, and keep studying water. We need a lot of good minds.
Karen, a good book and a reference for the class might be The Last Water Hole in the West by Dan Tyler, if it's not on the reading